It's a barn. Nora. It was always just a barn. That's my father, Roy Merrick, 61 years old, sitting at my kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks before my wedding, explaining to me why the place he had stood up at Christmas and told 19 people he was paying for had gone under. $18,400. That's what was in the account at the Ashfield barn, out on Ashfield Road, 11 miles outside Belmore, Ohio. He'd announced it with a glass in his hand. He'd let people clap. And on the 20th of June, he sat in my kitchen with his hat on his knee and told me the barn had gone under. And he was so sorry. And there was nothing anybody could do. I got married on the 11th of July, 2020, in the Belmore Volunteer Fire Company Hall, on Ash Street, in front of 41 people in folding chairs. I wore a borrowed dress, my husband's aunt's, from 1979. There wasn't time to alter it. So she took it in with 6 safety pins on the Thursday, and I got married inside it on the Saturday. And I have never been more grateful to anyone for anything. And then I spent 6 years apologizing to that woman's family for mine. I didn't argue with him. I want to be honest about why. Because it wasn't grace. There was nothing to argue. He'd brought me a fact. A building had died. You can't cross-examine a man about a building. So I said, "Okay, Dad." And I got up, and I put his coffee cup in the sink. Because that's what I do. And then I went and found a fire hall. Now I have to tell you about a drawer. There's a filing cabinet in the office at the Ashfield barn. It's beige. It's 4 drawers. And Hollis Ward's father bought it in 1996. In the 3rd drawer, there's a folder with my name on it. And inside the folder, there's 1 page. 1, with my father's handwriting on it. And a box he checked with a ballpoint pen. And his signature at the bottom. It's dated the 20th of June, 2020. He signed it at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning. He was in my kitchen by 10 past 2. I've driven that road. It takes 40 minutes. I did not know that page existed. For 6 years. I did not know that building existed. And at about 7:15 last Saturday evening, a 70-year-old man in a good tie needed that folder in front of 200 people. And I went and got it for him. Because I'm the one who gets it, and he was smiling the whole time. I'll tell you what's on it. I'll tell you every line. Not yet. Sit down a minute, close the door if you've got one. This one doesn't get loud. Nothing in my family has ever gotten loud. That's sort of the whole problem. And I'd rather not say it into an empty room. I didn't cry at that barn. I want that on the record early. Because I know how it sounds. I didn't cry in the office, and I didn't cry in the receiving line, and I didn't cry in the parking lot. I cried on Sunday, at 11 in the morning, folding a towel. Not even a good towel. Here's what I want in the comments. And I want the true answer, not the pretty one. Have you ever apologized, for years, to people who were kind to you? For something that was done to you? Because that's the piece I can't set down, not the money. I have thought about the money for exactly 6 days, and I'm nearly finished with it. But I spent 6 years saying sorry at a table full of people who had never once asked me to. And I would like somebody to explain to me where a person learns that. Before we go, hit the like if you're staying. Subscribe so the next one comes and finds you. And tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I like knowing who's out there on the nights the house is too quiet. Now, Wednesday, the 25th of March of this year. My kitchen counter, the mail. My name is Nora Beale. I'm 34. I was Nora Merrick for 28 years, and I've been Nora Beale for 6. And if you want to understand my family in one fact, it's this. My mother still writes Merrick on the envelope at Christmas, and she has never once thought about it. And if I brought it up, I would be the one who brought it up. I'm the secretary at Halloway Elementary in Grafton. 11 years. Front office. People hear that and picture a woman with a stapler. What I actually am is the person who knows where the thing is. Every day. All day. Somebody comes through that door and needs a piece of paper. And I get it. Field trip forms. Immunization records. The one custody letter in a drawer of 400 that says who is allowed to pick up a particular 6-year-old on a Thursday. 11 years of standing up before anybody finishes the sentence, because I already know which drawer. Remember that about me. I'm asking you seriously. Remember that. Because it's not a job. It's a thing that was installed in me a long time before Holloway Elementary. And last Saturday, it went off like a landmine. The mail that Wednesday was a water bill and a cream-colored envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Dylan and Cassidy, Saturday, July 11th, 2026. The Ashfield Barn. I read it twice. The order is the whole thing. I've gone over it so many times this week that I can tell you exactly which second broke which part of me. The first second was the barn. The Ashfield Barn is open. The Ashfield Barn is not under. The Ashfield Barn is printed on cardstock in my hand, in brown ink, with a little drawing of the hill. 6 years is a long time to carry a fact. You don't examine it after a while. You just carry it. That building was dead. It had been dead so long it had stopped being a building and turned into a kind of weather. A thing that happened to me. Out of the sky. In a bad year. And it was open. It had a website. It had a font. The second was the date. Saturday, July 11th. That's my anniversary. That's my wedding. That is the exact day. The 11th of July, 6 years to the day. That I got married in a fire hall in a dress held together with 6 safety pins. I sat down on the kitchen floor, not dramatically, my legs just stopped being interested. Marcus found me there about 20 minutes later. My husband is 36 and he fixes furnaces, which means he spends his working life in other people's basements at the worst moment of their week. And he has a very specific way of coming into a room where something is wrong. He doesn't ask. He gets low. He sat down across from me with his back against the dishwasher and he read the card. And then he read it again. Which is what I'd done. And seeing him need to read it twice was the first time in 6 years I felt like I wasn't crazy. He said, "That's your day." I said, "I know." And he didn't say anything else for a while. And then he said, "Nora, that barn's open." I know. The wedding was 108 days away. I want you to hold that number. Because I counted them. All of them. One at a time. Like a woman going down a rope. I know that gravel. That's the thing that got me. Sitting on the floor. Not the card. The gravel. Because the second I saw the drawing of that hill, my body was back on it. And I could hear it under the tires. And it was a good sound. It used to be the best sound I knew. Saturday, the 14th of September, 2019. We drove out there in Marcus's truck with a check in my purse, and both of us dressed better than we needed to be. The way you do when you're 27, and you're about to spend more money at one time than you have ever spent on anything. Ashfield Road goes up. That's the trick of the place. You come around the last curve and the hill just hands you the whole valley. And there's the barn sitting on top of it. Gray board, red roof. And the light comes in from the west through the big doors and lands on the floor in a stripe about 40 feet long. Hollis Ward was standing in that stripe with a rubber band around a receipt book. He's a short, thick, sunburned man who wears a tie to work and has never once looked comfortable in it. He calls every woman he has ever met Hun, including, I would find out, the ones about to end his best customer. He's been running that barn since 1996. 30 years. He did not pitch us. We walked in braced for a salesman and got a man who looked at his watch and said, "What time you thinking?" I said 6. And he said, Good. What's the date? I said July 11th. And he said, second Saturday. That's the one. Hunter's second Saturday in July, the sun comes in that door at 6:10, and it doesn't leave till 7. Anybody tells you different, they're selling you the first Saturday. Then he stood there and let us look at it. That's all. A man with a receipt book, letting two broke people look at a stripe of light. We gave him $2,600. I want to be very precise about that money, because it's going to matter more than anything else in this story. $2,600, ours, mine and Marcus's, out of a joint account we'd had for 4 months, saved in an envelope in the freezer before that because we were 27 and that's where you keep it. Marcus's hand shook when he wrote it. He'll deny that. It shook. Hollis took the check and he wrote us a receipt in that book with a carbon under it. And he tore out the top copy and gave it to me. And then he held up the yellow one, the copy. And he said the sentence that saved my life 6 years later. And he said it the way you'd say anything, because he had no idea he was saying anything. And this goes in the file. We don't throw anything out here. Hunter, my dad, bought that cabinet in '96, and I've never had the heart. Then he wrote our names on a folder. I watched him do it. Blue pen, block letters. Merrick/Beal, July 11th, 2020. And then Marcus's truck wouldn't start. It was a '99 Ranger and it had opinions. And it sat there in the gravel going nothing, nothing, nothing. And Hollis Ward came out of that barn with a set of jumper cables before Marcus got the hood up. 60-something years old, in his tie, leaning over an engine bay in the last of the light. He got grease on the tie, a stripe of it, right down the front. He looked at it and laughed and said, "Well, that's a Saturday. I have thought about that man's tie for 6 days now." We drove home with the receipt in the glove box, and I said something to Marcus about how we should send him a card at Christmas, and Marcus said we should send him a tie. And we laughed about it for about 11 miles. And then, we never did either one, because that's what people are like. That's the barn. That's the whole crime scene. And it took 11 minutes, and it was the happiest hour of my adult life. I was still on the kitchen floor. Marcus got up and got me a glass of water I didn't drink. And I sat there with a cream-colored card in my hand and the sound of that gravel in my ears. And somewhere in the back of my head, a very small voice, one I'd been keeping in a box for 6 years, said, "Ask." So I did. That was the mistake. I called my mother at 8 o'clock that night. Carol Merrick has answered the telephone on the first ring every day of her life, like a woman expecting news. I said, "Mom, I got Dylan's card. The Ashfield barn?" And she said, "Isn't it beautiful out there?" Cassidy's mother nearly cried. And I said, and I kept it so light. I want you to understand how light I kept it. I sounded like a woman asking about a recipe. I said, "Mom, Dad told me that place went under." There was a pause. It wasn't long. It was maybe a second and a half. And then my mother said, "Nora, that was 6 years ago." Which is not an answer. I want to point that out gently. The way it was done to me. That is not an answer. That's a date. She handed me a date and let me do the rest. And I stood in my kitchen and did the rest. Because I've been doing the rest for 34 years. Then I said the other thing. I said, "Mom, it's the 11th of July. And she said, "Oh, honey, nobody planned that. Nobody planned that." I've turned that sentence over more than any other sentence in this story, including the ones on the paper. Because she's right. Nobody did. Nobody sat down with a calendar and picked my anniversary out of a hat to hurt me. It didn't occur to anyone. It wasn't available to occur to anyone. My wedding was not a date that existed in that family's head to be avoided. You can't step around something you can't see. And then my mother went from the barn to my nephew's ear infection in one breath, with no bridge on it at all, the way a woman steps off a dock. That's her one tell. 34 years. one tell, and she has never known she has it. I hung up, and I felt fine. That's the part I need you to hear. I hung up, and I felt fine, because I'd asked. And nothing had happened. And nothing happening is what I was raised to call peace. My father called me the next morning. At 9:40 on a Thursday, while I was at my desk at Halloway with a line of kindergartners waiting for ice packs, which means my mother called him the second I hung up, which means my question, my one light, recipe-voiced question, traveled 11 miles that night and got someone out of a chair. I took it in the parking lot. He didn't defend anything. I want to be clear, because this is the part people get wrong about men like my father. He didn't say, "That's not true." He didn't say, "You misheard me." My father has never once in his life said a sentence he couldn't take back. That's not a habit. That's an architecture. And he's been building it since before I was born. What he said was, "Your mother says you're upset." And I said, "I'm not upset. Dad, the barn. You said it closed." And he let it sit. He's very good at letting it sit. And then he said, "Warm as a hand on your back. Sweetheart, if this is going to be hard for you, you don't have to come. I want to take that one apart on the table, because it's a machine, and I'd like you to see the gears." He did not say I was wrong. He did not say he was right. In one sentence, he agreed that something was hard, put it inside me, made it a weather system in my chest instead of a fact in a filing cabinet. And then, this is the beautiful part. This is the part that made me stand in a parking lot with my mouth open. He offered to help me with it. By removing me from my brother's wedding. That's not a threat. You can't call it a threat. Take it to any judge in Ohio. It's a kindness. He'd have said so, and he'd have believed it. My father says the cruelest things anybody has ever said to me in the voice you'd use to offer somebody a coat. And I said, "No, I'll be there. I'm fine." I folded in 4 seconds, 6 years, one question, 4 seconds. And he said, good girl." And then, "And I would like you to sit in this the way I have had to sit in it," he said. "Say, you're the organized one. Would you take the guest book? Cassidy's people are useless." And I said, "Sure, Dad." He offered to take my brother's wedding away from me. And then he gave me a job at it. And I said, "Sure," inside of one phone call, standing on the blacktop outside an elementary school, in March, with a line of 6-year-olds waiting on me. That's the whole family. Right there. You don't need the rest of it. But I'm going to tell you the rest of it anyway, because there's a piece of paper coming. I sat in my car for 11 minutes after that call. There's a tin in my glove box. It's an Altoids tin. And the hinge is going. And there are 6 safety pins in it. They're Nadine's. They came out of that dress on the 11th of July, 2020 at about 10 o'clock at night, in a bathroom at a fire hall. And I put them in that tin the way you'd put something in a tin, without deciding anything. And then I just never stopped having them. I've carried them for 6 years, through 2 cars. I don't take them out. I'm not a woman who sits in a car and looks at them. I want to be clear that I'm not that sad. But I know they're there. Every hard room I've walked into since 2020, I've had one of those pins on the inside of whatever I was wearing, down by the seam where nobody would ever see it. And I couldn't tell you why. And I have never said that out loud until right now. Marcus knew anyway. He'd never say. That night, he asked me the only question anyone asked me in 108 days. He said, "Nora, what if you just didn't go? Like it was available. Like it was a thing sitting on a shelf that a person could reach up and take." And I said, "I go. That's what I do, I go." He looked at me for a second, and then he said, "Okay." And he got up and did the dishes. And neither of us said anything else about it for 3.5 months. Now I have to tell you about a telephone call I did not hear. On Monday. The 6th of April. My father called Hollis Ward to settle up on my brother's wedding. 96 days out. I didn't know about that call for 96 days. Either. I found out about it standing in an office at that barn last Saturday, with the door open. From Hollis himself, who told it to me as a funny story. He was still telling it as a funny story when he got to the end of it. That's what I can't get out of my head. Here's what my father said. Hollis remembers it. Because Hollis remembers everything. It's practically a medical condition with him. My father said, "Now, Hollis, let's just start a fresh contract on Dylan's. No sense dragging up old paper. No sense dragging up old paper. Not shred the file. Not lose the form." My father has never in his life said a sentence he couldn't unsay, and he wasn't about to start with a man he'd known since 1996. He said no sense dragging up old paper, in that warm voice, the coat voice. And if Hollis Ward had said sure thing, Roy, and dropped one folder in a wastebasket on his way to lunch, my father would have gone to his grave a good man, and I would have spent the rest of my life apologizing at a table in Grafton. And Hollis Ward said, "Can't do her, Roy, it's the same account, it's all one file." And my father said, "Hollis does the pause when he tells it. He thinks the pause is the joke." My father said, "Sure, of course." And then they talked about the weather. Hold both of those men in your head for a second. I've been holding them all week, and it's the closest thing to God I've felt in years. One of them asked, in the politest possible way, for the only evidence of the worst thing he ever did to quietly stop existing. And the other one said no, because his father bought a filing cabinet in 1996, and he never had the heart to empty it. That's the hinge of my entire life. Not courage, not justice. A man in Ashfield, Ohio, with a sentimental streak about office furniture. 96 days to go. Now let me back up, because you need Christmas. The 25th of December, 2019. My parents' dining room, which seats 12 and had 19 people in it. Which is how my mother likes it. My grandmother's plates, somebody's kid under the table, and my father stood up with a glass in his hand. Understand, we had already paid. We'd put the $2,600 down in September, 3 months earlier. My father knew that. He'd asked me the date and the price in his kitchen in October, and I'd told him, proudly, the way you tell your dad you handled something. And he'd nodded and said, "Atta girl," and changed the subject. So he stood up on Christmas and he said, "Before Carol brings the pie, I've got the barn." 4 words. 19 people applauded in my parents' dining room. My uncle whistled. My grandmother, who was 89 and did not know what a barn was, applauded because she could feel the room. And my brother Dylan said, "Attaboy, Dad." My brother is 32 now. He was very young then, and I don't hold Christmas against him, because he was a kid at a table doing what the table did. I found out my father was paying for my wedding at the same moment as everybody else in that room. He didn't ask me. He didn't call me. He stood up. And here's what I did, because you should know what you're dealing with. I cried. At the table. Happy. I got up and I hugged my father, and everybody said, "Oh." And I meant it. I meant every second of it. I have a picture of it. My mother posted it. Nobody in that room heard what he said. Listen to it again. "I've got the barn. Not I'm paying for Nora's wedding. Not Nora and Marcus are getting married and we're covering it." He didn't say my name. He didn't say Marcus's name. My father stood up in a room of 19 people and announced a possession. In the truck going home, Marcus was quiet for about 6 miles. Then he said, "Nora, did he know we already paid?" And I said yes. And Marcus didn't say anything else. He didn't say anything else for 6 years. That's not neglect. That's a man who understood. In a truck. On the 25th of December, 2019, that saying the next sentence would make his wife choose between him and her father. And who decided at 29 years old that he was never going to make me do that? Not once, 6 years, he never made me choose. On Monday, the 6th of January, 2020, my father wrote a check to the Ashfield barn for $15,800. 2,600 of ours, 15,800 of his, $18,400, sitting in an account in a filing cabinet on top of a hill. And he showed it to me. He drove to my apartment in Grafton on his way to the post office, and he took the envelope out of his coat, and the check out of the envelope, and he held it up at eye level, at arm's length, the way a man holds up a fish. He didn't hand it to me. He showed it to me. There's a difference, and my father has spent his entire life inside it. Then he put it back in the envelope and drove to the post office. 59 days out from my brother's wedding, the 13th of May of this year, my father posted a photograph of the Ashfield barn to the family group chat. The caption said, "Paid in full. Second Saturday in July. Best light in Ohio. 11 hearts." I hearted it. I want you to know that I hearted it. I was standing in the copy room at Halloway Elementary, and I looked at a photograph of the hill and I tapped the little heart. Because everybody else had. And because not tapping it would have been a thing I did. And in my family, the only sin that's ever been prosecuted is doing a thing. Now, the 20th of June, 2020, 10 past 2 in the afternoon. I had the seating chart out on the table, little paper rectangles. I'd cut them myself because I'd seen it on the internet and I was 28, and I thought that's what you did. My father came in without knocking, which was normal, and took his hat off, which was not. He sat down across from me and he put the hat on his knee and he said, "Honey, the barn's gone under." That's all, 5 words. Now here's what I've learned about my father in 6 days. And it took a filing cabinet to teach me. A liar over-explains. A liar gives you the manager's name and the phone call and the exact wording. My father under-explains. He hands you 3 or 4 words and then he stops talking and lets your own head do the construction. And when it's built, you can't be angry at him about it. Because it's your house. He didn't build it. You did. He just delivered the lumber and left. I said, "What do you mean?" "Gone under." He said, "Closed up. That's all I know." I said, "When?" "We were out there, Dad. We were out there in September." And he said, "It's a hard year. Everybody's going under." I need to stop here and say something out loud before you say it, because I've been saying it to myself for 6 days. It was the summer of 2020. That's it. That's why I believed him. That year. Every building in America was going under. You could have told me the courthouse went under. You could have told me the Ohio River went under. It was a season in this country when the whole world was quietly closing and nobody was surprised by anything. And a person didn't check. And a person didn't call around. Because everybody already knew. My father did not need a good lie. He needed a year, and one was standing right there, holding the door. I asked about the money. That was my one shot. I want you to know I took it. 28 years old, 3 weeks out, seating chart in pieces on the table. And I looked at my father and I asked about the money. And he said, "Don't worry about the money. Listen to it, please. Listen to what is not in it." He didn't say we lost the money. He didn't say I'm getting the money back. He didn't say it's gone. He said, "Don't worry about the money," which is a man handing you a hat and letting you decide what's in it. And I was 28 and I was drowning, and I put the hat on. I did not worry about the money. For 6 years, I did not worry about the money. My father told me not to. So I didn't. That's how it works. That's exactly, precisely how it works. And if you've ever wondered how a grown woman doesn't ask about $18,400 for 6 years, there's your answer. And it took him 5 words. Marcus asked, once, in August, after. I said Dad's handling it. And my husband looked at me for a long moment across a kitchen, and then he said, okay. And that was the last time in 6 years that anyone in my life said the word money to me about my own wedding. Because Marcus Beale decided in that second that asking me twice would cost me more than the money was worth. He was right. That's the thing that undoes me. He was right. Back to the table, the 20th of June. I started crying about the dress, not the barn. That's the thing about grief. It never has the manners to go after the big item. I was crying about a dress in a shop in Grafton that I had on a payment plan, that I was going to have to call and cancel on Monday, because the fire hall was $200 and I needed every dollar I had left to feed 41 people. And my father reached across my table and put his hand on my wrist. He's a warm man. Physically warm. I mean, his hands are always hot. And he said, gently, kindly, the way you'd talk to a horse. It's a barn, Nora. It was always just a barn. Then he put his hat on and left. He was in that kitchen for 19 minutes. I looked at the clock when he came in because I had a cake tasting at 3, and I looked at it again when the door shut. And I have carried those 19 minutes around like a stone in a coat pocket ever since, without knowing why. He'd signed the form at 20 minutes to 11 that morning. 4 days later, I called the barn. I want that in the record, because for 6 years I've believed I was a woman who never checked, and it turns out I did check, and that's worse. Wednesday, the 24th of June, 2020. I sat on my bed, and I dialed the Ashfield barn, and it rang 4 times and a machine picked up. A woman's voice. Recorded. Cheerful. You've reached the Ashfield barn. We're closed to walk-ins at this time and we're not taking new bookings. Please leave a message. And I hung up. And I sat on the edge of my bed and I said out loud, to nobody, in an empty apartment, okay, it's true. There it is. That's my one active investigation in 6 years. And it lasted 11 seconds. And it confirmed everything. I put the phone down and I felt something almost like relief, because the world had agreed with my father and now I could stop. Saturday, the 11th of July, 2020, the Belmore Volunteer Fire Company Hall on Ash Street. 41 people in folding chairs. They backed the pumper out into the lot and left the bay doors open. And the whole room smelled like diesel and Windex, and there were 41 folding chairs on a concrete floor with a drain in the middle of it. I got married standing over a drain. I'd like to tell you that bothered me. It didn't bother me for 1 second. It's the only detail in this entire story I have never once been ashamed of. Nadine Beale drove the dress over on the Thursday in a garment bag in the back of a Buick. She's Marcus's aunt. She got married in that dress in 1979 when she was 30 years old. She was a stranger to me. I'd met her twice. And she called my apartment on a Tuesday and said, now, honey, I have a dress, and it's ugly, and it's yours. It was not ugly. There wasn't time to alter it. There wasn't money to alter it. So she stood me on a kitchen chair on the Thursday night and took it in with 6 safety pins. Down the back seam, working from the bottom, with her reading glasses on the end of her nose. And she did not say one word the entire time about my father, or the barn, or the fire hall. She'd been told all of it. 40 minutes on a kitchen chair with a woman who knew everything and said nothing. Because she'd decided that what I needed that night was a dress and not a conversation. When she finished, she stood back and looked at me and she said, now don't you dare give it back. I never did. It's in a closet in Grafton in the same garment bag. Until yesterday, I had not looked at it in 6 years. And my father gave a toast. I need you to understand that I'm not being sarcastic. My father stood up in that fire hall, in front of 41 people in folding chairs, and gave the best speech in that room. It was beautiful. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. He talked about Marcus's hands. He'd noticed. My father notices. That's his whole gift. That's the entire engine. He'd noticed that Marcus fixes furnaces. That my husband's whole job is going into other people's cold houses in the middle of the night. And he built 4 minutes out of that. And he ended it by saying that he'd never worried about me being cold. And then he said, "A wedding's one day. A marriage is the rest of it." 41 people, in a fire hall, over a drain in the floor. My grandmother cried, Nadine cried, and my father cried. I've thought about those tears for 6 days, and I've landed somewhere, and I want to hand it to you carefully. I don't think they were fake. I think my father was genuinely, sincerely, wetly sad about a thing he had done on purpose, with a ballpoint pen, 3 weeks earlier. I think he stood in that fire hall and grieved a wedding he canceled, and meant it. And there's no word for that. Hypocrite, isn't it? A hypocrite knows. A hypocrite is at least awake. And here's what I finally got. Standing in an office at that barn last Saturday with a piece of paper in my hand. My father did not want the money. That's what took me 6 years and a filing cabinet. My father is not a thief. He has never stolen $1 in his life, and he'd fight you about it. And he'd be right. What my father wanted was to be the man who paid for his daughter's wedding. And he got that, in full, on the 25th of December, 2019, in a dining room, in front of 19 people, with a glass in his hand. He got every bit of it. The applause. The whistle. My grandmother clapping at a barn she couldn't picture. Me crying and hugging him in a photograph my mother posted. He got paid on Christmas. And then in June the bill came. And he found a year that would let him take the thing back without ever having to give the applause back. And then he stood up in a fire hall and got applauded again. He got paid twice for a wedding he canceled. Once for buying it, and once for mourning it. And the entire transaction cost him nothing, and $18,400 just sat on a hill, waiting, like a man's savings account, for a wedding he actually wanted to buy. That's not theft. I don't know what it is, but I know what it eats, and I know where it eats, and I know now that there is exactly one thing on this earth my father cannot survive losing, and it isn't money. It's a room. Now, the 6 years. I'm not going to give you 6 years. Nothing happened for 6 years. That's what 6 years are. I'll give you one Thursday. Thanksgiving, 2023. Marcus's mother's house. Eileen Beale sets a table for 14 and cooks for 30 and has never in her life let anyone help her. Which is its own kind of tyranny, and I love her for it. And somebody, I don't even remember who, one of Marcus's cousins, a kid, no malice in him at all, asked me whether my folks were coming. And I said, no, I'm sorry, my family's just, that's it. That's the sentence. I didn't even finish it. I never finished it. That sentence had been coming out of my mouth at that table for 3 years by then. In pieces, 90 different ways, at every holiday. And I want you to notice what's in it. I'm sorry. Nobody asked me a thing. A child asked if my parents were coming to dinner, and I apologized. And Nadine Beale put her hand on my wrist, same wrist my father grabbed. I noticed that this week. And I had to go stand in a parking lot. And she said, very quietly, just to me, "Honey, you've been apologizing at this table for 3 years. Nobody here has ever asked you to." And I said, I know. And I said, sorry. I said sorry to that. And then I did it for 3 more years. That's the part I want back. Not the barn. I want back the 6 years I spent apologizing to a table full of people who never once, not one single time, held my family against me. They gave me a dress. A woman I'd met twice put 6 pins in it and told me not to give it back. And I sat in her sister-in-law's kitchen for 6 years saying sorry until they stopped hearing it. Nobody did that to me. That's what I can't get past. My father never said one word about the Beals. I did that. I built it. Out of lumber somebody dropped in my yard in 2020 and drove away. If you've ever been the one apologizing for people who have never once apologized for you, I want a word from you in the comments. Just the word. Guest book. You'll know why in about 11 minutes. And I'll be reading them. Because I'm going to want the company. 20 days out. Sunday. The 21st of June, Father's Day. And yes, my father picked Father's Day for the dinner. And no, nobody in that family has ever noticed that he picks the day. Every time. 34 years. Cassidy's parents came, Maureen Nolan and her husband, up from Columbus, sitting in my mother's dining room with the good plates out. And my father stood up with a glass in his hand. I knew what was coming a full second before it came, and my hands went cold. And I was the only person at that table who knew what that glass meant. He said, "Before Carol brings the pie, I've got the barn." The same 4 words. 6.5 years later. Same room, same glass, same table, and every person there heard a generous man. And I heard a receipt. They applauded. Maureen Nolan applauded. And I did not ask one question. In March, I asked a light little question about a barn, and it cost me 11 minutes in a parking lot and a job at the door. And by June, I had learned. The way you learn a stove. And I sat there with my hands in my lap and said nothing. And then Cassidy, who I like, who I have always liked, who has never done a thing to me, leaned across and asked me, warm as anything, "Nora, where did you and Marcus get married?" And the table went quiet, just for a half a second of quiet. And my brother said, easy as breathing, buttering something. "Fire hall, it was actually really fun. It was actually really fun." That's my wedding. That's the whole thing. Summarized by the man it was paid for. Not cruel. He wasn't being cruel. I need you to understand that Dylan Merrick has never once in his life been cruel to me. And that's not a defense. That's the indictment. It was casual. It cost him nothing to say, and he'd forgotten it by the salad. And my father said, warmly, "That was a hard year for everybody." And the table nodded. Everybody nodded. Hard year. Hard year for everybody. And Maureen Nolan looked at me. She's the only person in that room who looked at me. A woman from Columbus who'd met me twice. And something in that half second of quiet made her turn her head. And she didn't say anything. And she went back to her plate. Remember her, 20 days. Thursday, the 9th of July. 2 days out. I drove the favors up. 200 little tins of maple candy in a cardboard box on my passenger seat, and the guest book, and a good pen. Because I'd bought a good pen. Nobody asked me to buy a good pen. I bought a good pen. I came around that last curve, and the hill handed me the valley, and I heard the gravel, and I had to pull over into the grass for a minute. 6 years. It's just a road. It's exactly the same road. There was a kid in a polo shirt running the setup. Trevor. Nice kid. 19 maybe. Called me ma'am about 9 times. And it did not occur to me to ask about anybody else. I'd spent 6 years thinking about that place as a hole in the ground. It had not crossed my mind that it had a person in it. The office is off the entryway, door on the left. It was open. I walked past it twice. Beige filing cabinet. 4 drawers. Against the far wall under a window. I could have thrown the pen and hid it. I've gone over this Thursday more than any day of my life. And here's what I've got. I looked right at that cabinet. I know I did. And my eyes went across it the way your eyes go across a fire extinguisher. And my father came out of the office. He had a clipboard. Because of course he did. He'd been in there for 20 minutes with Trevor going over the timeline. And he saw me standing in the entryway with a box of maple candy on my hip, and he smiled at me, and he said, "You don't need to go in the office, sweetheart. Hollis and I have it handled." And I said, "Okay. That's it. That's all that happened. One sentence from him. One word from me." And I turned around and put the box on a table. I'd like to tell you I felt something. A prickle. Anything. I've been trying all week to remember a prickle, and there isn't one. My father steered his own daughter around a filing cabinet with one gentle sentence, and I let him. The same way I let him do everything. And I drove home and made dinner. 11 feet. Saturday, the 11th of July, 2026. The light comes in that door at 6:10 and it doesn't leave till 7. He was right about that. Hollis Ward was right about the only thing anybody in this story ever told me that turned out to be true. They got married at 6, in the stripe. It was beautiful. I'm not going to take that away from them, and I wouldn't if I could. Cassidy wore her mother's veil. Dylan cried. Which I didn't expect, and which I liked him for. 200 people in white chairs on a hill in Ohio, and my brother crying at the top of them. I sat in the 4th row on the aisle, because that's where the card said, and I was not in one photograph, because nobody's aunt takes a picture of the guest book lady. I had one of Nadine's pins on the inside of my dress, down by the left seam, where nobody would ever see it. The receiving line formed at about 25 to 7 in the entryway, right where the light gives out. Bride, groom, my mother, my father, Maureen Nolan, Maureen's husband, 6 of them in a row, shaking 200 hands. And my table was at the head of it. Of course it was. Where else would you put a guest book? You put it where people come in. I had a card table with a white cloth on it, and the book, and the good pen, and 200 tins of maple candy in rows I'd straightened twice. I'd been standing there 40 minutes when Hollis Ward came down the line. He does that. 30 years. Every wedding. He walks the line at the end and shakes every hand in it. He'd worked all the way down to my father. I watched them shake hands. I watched my father put his other hand on top. He does that. It's a whole move. And then Hollis came the last 4 feet to my table. Because he signs the book. 30 years. He signs every book. And he stopped. And he looked at me for about 2 seconds with his head slightly to one side, and then his whole face opened up, and Hollis Ward said, at full volume, delighted, to a room, "You're the truck!" I said, "What?" "The Ranger, the 99, wouldn't turn over. I got grease on my good tie. 9, 10 years ago." 6, I said. It was 6. And what was happening in me at that second wasn't dread. It was pleasure. Some idiot part of me was pleased. A man remembered me. He remembered my husband's truck. After 6 years of being a woman nobody in my own family could see. A stranger looked at my face for 2 seconds and pulled up a Ford Ranger and a ruined tie, and for 1 second, standing at a card table. I felt like a person who exists. And then Hollis Ward smiled at me, warm as bread. This man, warm as anything I have ever met. And he said, "Well, I'm just glad it all worked out." And I said, "I'm sorry." And he said it. "We still had your deposit on file. Hunter and your dad said to hold it for the next one." The line stopped. Not dramatically. Nobody gasped. That's not how it goes, and I need you to know that. Because I've seen it in the movies, too. What actually happens is that 6 people in a receiving line and about 40 people behind them all keep their faces exactly where they were, and the room gets about 4 degrees colder. and somebody's glass makes a noise against a button. And nobody said anything for what I'd swear was 10 seconds. And then Cassidy, 20 minutes married, veil still on, holding her husband's hand, Defo, said, "Deposit?" She wasn't being smart. She wasn't being anything. My brother's wife heard a word she didn't understand at her own wedding and asked what it meant. And that is the most innocent sentence anybody said in that building all night. And it took the roof off. And Hollis Ward, still happy, still helping, still absolutely certain he was standing in the middle of a nice story about a family that came back, said, "Sure, hunnin', it's all in the same file. Been sitting in that cabinet since..." And he turned to go get it. He turned to go get it. And he took one step. And his knee did the thing a 70-year-old man's knee does. And he made a face and looked around for Trevor. And Trevor was outside with the van. And I said, "I'll get it. That's all. That's what I did. That's my whole part in this. And I want it flat. And I want nobody dressing it up later." A man needed a piece of paper, and I said, "I'll get it." Because I have been saying I'll get it since I was 9 years old. Because it's the only thing I have ever been to anybody. It is not a decision. It has never once in my life been a decision. It's a reflex. And my family installed it. And they used it for 34 years. And it never cost them $1. And my father said, "Nora, sit down." Out loud, in front of 200 people. I have never heard that man raise his voice. Not at my mother. Not at Dylan. Not at a referee. Not once in 34 years. My father's whole life is a voice he never raises. It's the entire architecture. It's how the coat gets on you. And he raised it at me, at a card table, over a filing cabinet. "Sit down." Everybody heard it. He convicted himself standing there, before the paper, before one word of it was read out loud. 200 people watched a man in a tuxedo panic about a receipt in front of everyone he has ever needed to impress, and every one of them did the arithmetic at the same time. I didn't stand up to him. I want to be careful here, because I know what you want it to have been, and it wasn't. I did not square my shoulders. I did not look him in the eye. I did not say one word to my father. I was already walking. That's all. A nice man needed a folder, and I'm the one who gets the folder. And by the time the word "sit down" arrived, I was 6 feet gone, and my legs did not consult me about it. The office, door on the left, beige cabinet, 4 drawers, under the window. 3rd drawer. There's a folder in there with my name on it in block letters, in blue pen, in the handwriting of a man who jumped my husband's truck. Merrick/Beal, July 11th, 2020. I stood in an office in a building my father told me was dead, holding a folder with my own name on it, and the noise of my brother's wedding came through the wall, and I opened it. 1 page. Ashfield Barn, event change/cancellation. Event Merrick Beal. Date July 11th, 2020. Reason for change. And this is his handwriting. This is my father's handwriting. I've had 34 years of birthday cards. I'd know it in the dark. Reason for change. Family decision. 2 words. He wrote family decision about a decision he made alone, at a counter. 11 miles from a kitchen where his daughter was cutting paper rectangles for a seating chart. Then the boxes, 3 of them, in a row. Refund per section 7, empty. Forfeit, empty. And the middle one, with a ballpoint X in it, pressed hard enough to dent the page. Transfer credit to future event, same family. Then the payments, 2 lines, typed. September 14th, 19, N. Merrick/M. Beal, $2,600. January 6th, 2020, R. Merrick, $15,800. Balance on account, $18,400. And at the bottom, on the line, Roy A. Merrick, June 20th, 2020. 10:40 a.m. He didn't lose my wedding. He moved it. I stood in that office and I want to tell you what actually took the top of my head off. Because it wasn't the money and it wasn't the lie. It was the box. Same family. He checked a box that said same family 3 weeks before my wedding, which means that on the 20th of June, 2020, at 20 minutes to 11 in the morning, my father already knew there was going to be another wedding in this family. He just knew it wasn't going to be mine. He hadn't met Cassidy. Dylan wasn't engaged. Dylan wasn't anything. He was a kid. There was no next one. There was no plan. My father stood at that counter with no idea on earth who or when, and he reached past refund, and he reached past forfeit, and he put an X in the one that said the money stays in this family for somebody else. He didn't know who yet. He just knew it wasn't me. And then he drove 40 minutes and sat in my kitchen for 19 minutes with his hat on his knee. And the $2,600. I stood there and did the arithmetic I had not been allowed to do for 6 years. And it is very short arithmetic. $2,600 of that money is mine. Mine and Marcus's. Out of an envelope in a freezer. Out of a hand that shook writing the check. 200 people were eating dinner on the other side of that wall. There's an arch on that hill with flowers on it that cost more than my entire wedding, and my brother stood under it and cried an hour ago, and some part of that arch is ours. My husband went into strangers' freezing basements at 2 in the morning, and I answered a phone at an elementary school. And we put $2,600 in an envelope in a freezer when we were 27 years old, and it bought my brother's arch. And I have been standing at a card table by the door of a wedding I helped pay for, handing out maple candy. I didn't cry. I've told you that. It's true, and it's not a virtue. I closed the folder and I walked back out. Nobody had moved. 200 people. And the line was still standing there in the entryway exactly the way I'd left it, because nobody knew what else to do with their bodies. And I handed the folder to Hollis Ward. I want that clear, and I want it clear forever. I did not hand that folder to my father. I did not hand it to my brother. I did not open it and read it out loud to a room. And I'd like you to know that the thought never entered my head. And I've checked. I've checked all week. Hollis Ward asked for the file. I get the file. That's all that happened. That is the entire extent of what I did on the 11th of July, 2026. And he pulled it out of the folder and he read it out loud, cheerfully, in that big warm voice. Because he was still, God help him, he was still in the middle of a nice story. There she is, 2600, September of 19, 15/8, January, 18/4, transfer credit, future event, same family, checked right there, signed, Roy A. Merrick, 20th of June, and he stopped. Because Hollis Ward can read a date. Because the top of that page says July 11th, 2020, and the bottom of that page says June 20th, 2020. And there is not a man alive who has run a wedding barn for 30 years who cannot tell you, instantly, without thinking about it, how many weeks are between those two numbers. He looked at the page, then he looked at the top of the page again, and the warm went out of that man's face like a shade drawn. 20th of June. And then Hollis Ward asked the question, not me. I want that in the record too. In 34 years, I have never asked my family a real question, and I did not ask one that night either. A 70-year-old stranger in a grease-stained tie asked it for me, and he asked it quietly. And he asked it to me, and he had to clear his throat first. Honorable, where'd you get married? And I said, the fire hall. 200 people. Nothing. Nothing at all for about 4 seconds. Somewhere back in the barn, the band was tuning up because nobody had told the band. and my father, and I need you to watch this, because this is the whole man. This is 67 years of him in one motion. My father did not confess. He turned to the room. Not to me. To the room. He put his hands out a little, palms down, the way you'd calm a dog, and he said, warmly, reasonably, to 200 people at his son's wedding, "Folks, this is an awful lot of noise about a barn." And then he turned to me, and he softened his voice, the coat voice, the horse voice, the voice that has worked on me every single day of my life. And he said, "Nora, it's a barn. It was always just a barn." He said it again. He stood in it and said it again, on the floor of it, under the lights of it, 40 feet from an arch he bought with it. At the wedding he moved my wedding into. And that's when I knew he was never going to understand. Not ever. Not on his deathbed. Because he wasn't lying that time, he meant it. To my father, it was just a barn. And it had always been just a barn. And the only thing on this earth that was ever worth anything was the 4 words he got to say, standing up with a glass in his hand. And my brother said, July 11th. Just the date. That's all Dylan said. He was still under the lights in his tux with his wife's hand in his. And he'd finally gotten there. And it took him about 9 seconds. And he said the date out loud like a man reading a number off a wall. Then he looked at the table. At me, at the table, at the book, at my hand. And he said, "You've been..." And he couldn't finish it. Because I was still holding the pen. I'd been standing there the whole time holding the good pen I bought. I never put it down. Through all of it. The truck. The deposit. Sit down. The office. The folder. The 20th of June. I stood at my station at my brother's wedding holding a pen. Because nobody had released me. And my mother said, "Roy, tell me you didn't." Which is not a shocked woman. I want you to hear it the way I heard it. That is a woman who has wondered. That is 6 years of not asking. Arriving all at once. At a wedding. In front of her son's in-laws. My mother didn't learn anything on Saturday. My mother found out she'd been right. And Maureen Nolan. Remember her? The woman from Columbus who looked at me at Father's Day. Maureen Nolan didn't say one word. She stepped out of the receiving line. And she walked around behind my father. And she put her arm through her daughter's. And she stood there. That was the verdict. That's the only verdict there was. A woman moved 4 feet. I didn't raise my voice. I want to say that. And then I want to say the true thing about it. Because I've heard women say it in a proud way, and I can't. I didn't raise my voice. And it wasn't strength. And it wasn't dignity. I have never raised my voice in my life. Not once. Not at anyone. That's not a virtue. That's a thing that was installed. Marcus came through the crowd at about 7:45. He didn't look at my father. He didn't look at anybody. My husband walked up to that card table and took the pen out of my hand and set it down on the cloth. He said, "Okay, we're done." And I said, "I didn't finish the book." And he said, "I know." At about 8 o'clock, I picked the pen back up. I want to be honest with you, and I think this is the truest thing in the whole story. Truer than the paper. My husband gave me a way out of that table, and I went back to it. Nobody made me. Nobody asked me to. Nobody in that building would have said one word if I had walked out to the parking lot and gotten in the truck and gone home to Grafton. I stood at that card table until 9:40 at night, and I got every name. All 200. There is not one line missing in that book. Whatever happened to me in that entryway, the guest book at Dylan and Cassidy's wedding is complete. And it's beautiful. And I did that. And there is nobody left to blame for the last 2 hours of that night but me. My father left at 9:40. He didn't say goodbye to my brother. He didn't say goodbye to anybody. He came through the entryway with my mother about 6 feet behind him, and he had his hat in his hand, and he stopped at my table. And he signed the guest book. He picked up my good pen, and he leaned over and he wrote his name in my brother's guest book on his way out of the wedding he had just detonated, because leaving without signing would have looked like something, and my father has never once done a thing that looked like something. Roy Americ. Same hand, same name, the same signature that was on that form. 11 feet away, in the third drawer of a beige cabinet, twice in one night, in one building, in one hand. And I handed him the pen. I did. I handed my father the pen. He didn't look at me, and I didn't say anything, and I held it out, and he took it, and he signed, and he gave it back, and he walked out into the gravel. That's the last time I saw my father. He has not called. 6 days. He won't. I want to explain why. Because I understand my father now the way you understand a machine after it takes your hand. Calling would be a thing he did. He'd have to say a sentence he couldn't take back. 67 years, and there is not one of those in him. He'd rather lose me than say one. And on Saturday, at 9:40 at night, with his hat in his hand, he did the arithmetic and lost me. My mother called on Sunday. She didn't apologize either. She asked me a question, and it was the first real question anybody in my family has asked me in 34 years. And it came out of her small and flat, like something she'd been holding in her mouth all night. Was there anything else? And I said, Mom, there's always something else. And she hung up. Not angry. She just hung up. My mother is 65 years old, and she's got 6 years of arithmetic to do, and she's going to do it alone in that house with him. And I don't have one thing to give her about it. Hollis Ward called on Monday. That man has apologized to me 4 times now for the crime of remembering my husband's truck. He keeps saying, I thought I was telling you something nice. I asked him about the machine. I told him I'd called on the 24th of June, 2020, and I told him what the recording said, and I asked him if it was true. And he was quiet for a second, and then he said, Hunter, that machine ran all that June. We were closed to walk-ins. Couldn't have 100 strangers wandering through. And then, and I could hear him hearing it as he said it. We did 9 weddings that summer. 9 weddings that summer. I called. I want to say that once more, and then I'm going to put it down. I called that barn, and a machine told me the truth. And the truth was closed to walk-ins. And I heard closed, because my father had already handed me the lumber. He told me why he's never emptied that cabinet. 2. It came out at the end of the call. Sideways. The way the real thing always does. It's got nothing to do with my family. It's about his father. And 1996. And something that happened at that barn before I was born. And it is the saddest thing anybody has ever told me on a telephone. That's a different night. I'll tell you when I can say it right. Dylan called on Tuesday. He didn't apologize. Give him that much. He didn't do the thing where you apologize to make the other person say it's fine. He asked me one question. How much of it was yours? And I said $2,600. And there was a long silence. And then my brother said the only true thing he has ever said to me. I don't know how to give that back. He overnighted a check. It came Thursday. Of course he overnighted it. My brother has solved things with speed his whole life. That's what being the easy one does to you. It went on my refrigerator, under a magnet from a pizza place. And I looked at it for 2 days. And here's the part I keep coming back to at 2 in the morning, so I'm going to hand it to you and let you carry some of it. My father didn't lose any money. Not $1, not in this entire story. He spent $18,400 on exactly what he wanted, and he got the applause twice, and he got a barn on a hill with the best light in Ohio. What he lost is the room. 200 people from that county watched Roy Merrick tell his daughter to sit down about a receipt. And there is not a dinner table left in Belmore, Ohio, for the rest of that man's life, where he can stand up with a glass in his hand. He'll never do it again. Somebody at that table will be thinking about it. And he'll know, and he'll stay in his chair. He took my wedding to buy a room, and the room is what the barn took back. I didn't do that. I didn't do one thing. I went and got a folder. If you're sitting there tonight running your own arithmetic on somebody, I'd like you to do one thing for me. Don't go looking for the paper. That's not the lesson, and I'd be lying if I sold it to you that way. There isn't a filing cabinet for most of it. Most of you are never going to get a Hollis Ward. Just stop telling yourself you didn't check. You checked. You called. You got the machine. And the machine said closed. And you believed it. Because a person you loved had already told you what was true, and you were 28, and you were drowning. That's not stupid. That's a daughter. Yesterday I took the garment bag out of the closet. 6 years. I've moved it twice. I never once unzipped it. And that isn't sentiment. That's the opposite of sentiment. You don't look at a thing because looking costs money you don't have. I put it in the back seat and I drove out to Nadine's. She's 77 now. She came to the door with her reading glasses on the end of her nose, the same way she had them in 1979, and the same way she had them on a Thursday night in July of 2020. And she looked at the garment bag over my arm and she didn't say one word about it. Just stepped back and let me in and put the kettle on. That's the whole family I got. That's the entire inheritance. A woman who doesn't ask. We put it on the kitchen table between us. Didn't take it out. Just laid it there. This long white shape on a table. And the two of us sat down on either side of it. And I opened my mouth. And what came out of me? 34 years. Every table. Every holiday. Every time. What started to come out of me was, I'm sorry about my... And I stopped. I want to be honest with you. It wasn't strength. Nothing in this story is strength. I just heard it. For the first time in 6 years. On the way out of my mouth. I heard it. And I closed my mouth. And I sat there in a kitchen in Ohio with my hands flat on a table. And I did not say it. It took about 4 seconds. The same 4 seconds it took me to fold on the telephone in March. That's what 4 seconds is worth. That's the whole exchange rate. And Nadine Beale looked at me over her glasses, and she put one hand flat on that garment bag, and she said, There she is. That's it. That's all she said. 3 words from a woman I'd met twice, who put 6 pins in a dress and told me not to give it back, and then waited 6 years. At a table. Without ever once asking me for anything. For me to stop apologizing to her for the crime of being related to my father. I cried in her kitchen, not the folding a towel kind, the other kind. And she let me, and she didn't touch me, because she knew. Here's what I've done about the money. And it's not much. And it isn't wisdom. I called the Belmore Volunteer Fire Company this morning. They're getting Dylan's check. $2,600. Endorsed over. The whole thing. The woman on the phone got very quiet and then she said they'd been trying to replace the chairs since before she started there. The folding chairs. The ones on the concrete over the drain in the floor. So it's chairs. My brother's guilt is going to be 40 new folding chairs in a fire hall on Ash Street. And some girl whose father tells her the barn went under is going to sit in one of them. And she won't know. And that's fine. That's not for her to know. The woman asked what to put on the card. I said, please don't put anything. She said they'd want to. I said, please. She asked again. She was kind about it. And I said, put Nadine. Just the first name. Nobody in that hall will ever know who that is. Nobody in my family will either. My father couldn't pick that woman out of a lineup. He has never once said her name. That's the point. That's exactly what she was to me. A name nobody in my family ever had to learn. People say blood is thicker than water like it's a promise. It's not a promise. It's a description. And it's accurate. And nobody ever finishes the sentence. Thick things don't move. Thick things sit in a drawer for 6 years with a box checked on them. The people who came and got me came in a Buick with a dress in the back seat. My father has a standing invitation to my house. I mean that. I'm not going to sit here and perform a wall for you. The door isn't locked, and it never has been, and he knows the address. But he has to come here. And he has to come alone. And he has to come with nothing to announce. And I don't think he can do it. I've thought about it all week, and I don't think that man is physically capable of walking into a room with 2 people in it and no glass in his hand. A room that small has never had anything in it for him. I think it's the only room my father has ever been afraid of. And I think I'm going to be sitting in it for the rest of my life with the coffee on, and I think he's going to die in a chair 11 miles from here. Not standing up. I'm not going to the next one. That's the only thing I've decided. There will be a next one. A shower. A Christmas. A funeral. There always is. And for 34 years the answer was that I go. Because I go. Because that's what I do. I'm not going. Not out of anger. I want that clear. Because I'd like one thing in this story to be clean. It's just that going was never a kindness. It was a reflex. And they billed against it. And I'm the one who let them. And the bill's closed. We took the pin out at Nadine's table. The one from Saturday. Off the inside seam of my dress, where nobody ever saw it. She held out her hand and I put it in her palm. And then I gave her the tin. I'd carried it up her steps in my fist, and I don't remember taking it out of the car. She didn't ask what it was. Of course she didn't. She opened it up and dropped the 6th one in with the other 5. 6 of them. All 6. In an Altoids tin with a bad hinge, on a kitchen table in Ohio, with the woman who loaned them to me. That's the first time since the 11th of July, 2020, that all 6 of those pins have been in the same room. She closed the lid. She pushed the tin back across the table to me, and she said, "Keep 'em, honey. You never know." And I drove home, and I did not apologize to anybody. Doors, not walls. Same chair next time.